Hello, everyone. Really appreciate everyone coming to our talk today. My name's Joe Essenfeld. I'm the CEO and founder of Jibe, and I'm really excited to have Sjoerd Gehring join me from Johnson & Johnson. We're going to give a talk today for just about 20 minutes, and we're going to focus on trying to really solve a business problem that's affecting so many people. And we're going to try and give you two different perspectives on solving this problem. I'm going to talk about it a little bit more from a technology provider. We've been in business for about 10 years, and what Jibe does is we focus on making incredible career sites on an enterprise SaaS platform. So we specialize working with large global companies who have a lot of complexity, a lot of difficulty getting a really good unified consumer experience. So we've been working on that now for almost a decade. And the problem that we're going to talk about is this talent shortage. How are we finding skilled workers in a market where the population of them is shrinking, wages for them are inflating, and when we look forward 7 or 8 years, what are the systems that we're putting in place now to really overcome that problem? So I'm going to let Sjoerd go ahead and introduce himself in his role at J&J, and then we'll start the discussion. Thanks so much.
Great. Well, good afternoon. Great to be here. I'm Sjoerd Gehring. I'm the Global Head of Recruiting for J&J, and I also lead our people experience efforts for the company. So how employees are interacting with the company, both from a digital and from a physical touchpoint perspective.
Great. So Sjoerd, can you talk a little bit about the skilled workers that are difficult for you to find at J&J and some of the initiatives that you're doing today to find them?
Yeah, so maybe to ground a little bit on J&J's numbers. So we recruit roughly 30,000 people a year, all around the world. Roughly 9,000 to 10,000 of them sit here in the US. And I think every year, certain skill sets become much harder for us to fill. So this year, we're very focused on data science, e-com roles, digital marketing is still really hard for us to fill. And I think with the economy here in the US being what it is becoming increasingly difficult for us to attract that type of talent to the company.
So as we look at attracting that talent now, have you seen those markets for that type of talent get harder to fill? Are you seeing those populations just get more competitive to bring those workers in?
I think it's much harder to fill if you look at the supply-demand situation, but I also think that candidates are looking for different things these days. And so I think candidates are becoming very frustrated with disconnected digital experiences on the employer side. We survey our candidates on a weekly basis. We get roughly 1.4 million people in our pipelines every year, and we have hundreds of thousands of candidates providing feedback on our hiring process. And what we hear over and over again is that they just don't accept these hugely disconnected digital experiences anymore inside of a corporate recruiting environment. And those have to do with transparency, level of jobs, pay equity things. And so that's one of the hardest things for us to solve, is the numbers work against us, but we're also dealing with candidates who are expecting very different experiences than we've ever been able to provide before.
Got it. So if we fast forward and really take that information about giving a more connected experience, and it's not necessarily about wages or just your comp package, but really how you're getting them through the process and how you're introducing them to the company, what's the groundwork that you're laying now so when we look out into 2025, you're hopefully going to be in a better position than your competition for bringing those people into the company?
You know, one of the things that we've done at J&J is we've determined kind of what will be like the candidate experience to look like and the hiring manager experience to look like. And I think it's really tempting, especially if you walk the floor here at HR Tech, for people in roles like mine to say, I want to add an AI bot, I want to add kind of a fancy HR Tech solution into my ecosystem so I can show my internal business partners that I'm being innovative as a recruiting leader. What's much more difficult to do is to create a holistic, connected ecosystem that's really focused on the needs of the user. And that's what we've been focused on. And in many ways, I think that's why the Jibe J&J partnership works so well. You know, one of the things that we did last year was we focused on the creation of a digital platform that would solve the lack of transparency to candidates in the recruiting process. And so when we asked for candidate feedback around what is your biggest frustration in corporate recruiting processes, it was always the total lack of transparency in terms of where am I in the recruiting process. If I apply to a job and I never hear back from the company, that doesn't sound or feel like a consumer experience that I get at Amazon or anywhere else. And so when we built the Shine platform for J&J together, we are now getting candidate feedback that says, J&J rejected me for a role, but you really treated me like a human being in the process, like a consumer in the process, and as a result, we're creating very different experiences.
No, that's great. And hopefully that investment in that now will pay off as the market gets more competitive as we go. So if we take a step back and look at it from a technology perspective, in the past 10 years, my first HR tech, everything was about social recruiting. So I see some familiar faces out in the audience, and I know you guys remember that. Everything was Facebook and LinkedIn, and the feeling was that was going to revolutionize and change fundamentally how everyone recruited. The fact is, I don't think it did, but it did give us some new practices, and it did improve how we were doing recruiting. And then very shortly after that, everything was about mobile and mobility. It's going to be a new way of interacting with candidates, and it truly was. However, again, nothing really fundamentally changed, it just incrementally improved. And then as Sjoerd mentioned, this year, every booth, including Jibe's, is talking about AI and chatbots and automation and better matching, and it's truly this kind of Web 3.0 kind of hysteria being powered by AI. And I keep hearing how it's going to be transformed and going to change everything. So the question to Sjoerd is, someone who's seen this technology flow through and every day has to successfully deliver hires, is what's really going on with these trends that come up that are supposed to revolutionize recruiting? What are they actually doing, and what should we expect from this latest one of AI and chatbots and matching?
Yeah, I think it's one of the hardest things for people in roles like mine to wrap their heads around, because there's so much. I mean, just look at this floor. I mean, there's so much available. Some of it's really good, some of it might not be as good yet. But it all has a role in the ecosystem. I think one of the hardest things for us to do is to create an ecosystem where the experience works for the company you represent. And so the way that we think about it at J&J is, if we map out what we want our candidate experience to be, we then look at what are the elements of that experience where we want to be as good as anyone else. And for those areas, we go out and buy. And for the areas where we feel that we really want to compete and we want to create a differentiated, uniquely ownable experience for J&J, those are the areas where we would build. And so my recommendation to peers would be, if you have the luxury to build in the areas where it really makes sense, because I think if you talk about Web 2.0 and 3.0 with AI, I think the next chapter of that will be experience, and how companies can create a uniquely ownable experience that's reflective of the corporate values of your company. That experience will win, I think, the future talent.
That's great. Do you have any predictions on Web 4? What do you think is going to happen as the next generation, or 2019 HR tech? Is it still going to be AI, or are we going to move on?
I think companies win when someone who can truly connect these different parts of the ecosystem, and I think that's what I mean with experience. So I think Web 4.0 probably is experience, and something that is truly reflective not just of the jobs you hire for, but the company you are. And so to make that very concrete, at J&J, we deeply care about our credo. And so we're celebrating the 75th anniversary of our credo this year. We just recently built a credo assessment that assesses candidates at the very top of the recruiting funnel on our set of corporate values. And so that's unique to J&J, but that's what I mean. If you make that an integral part of the experience, I think that's how experience will ultimately kind of win in the future.
That's great. And one thing that we've noticed from a technology standpoint is that 10 years ago, everyone was on a single system. They're on an ATS and they expected it to do everything. As mobile came out, it broke that expectation because it wasn't possible. And then we saw this best of breed approach really take over. And it became this spider web of vendors to manage and became very complicated. And now we're seeing this massive shift back. And we're seeing a lot of migration to Workday, and hopefully that solves everything out of the box. And I think to what Sjoerd was saying, I agree. I think Web 4 is going to have to be, how do you get back to best in breed, but have it all fit together in a much more cohesive way, so you actually have a platform that does well, not one that just falls apart. So if we look at, on top of the technology, the actual people working in the workforce, I think that's kind of the last point I'd love to discuss. My company is about 85% made up of millennials. And when we first started having them enter our business, it was a lot of software engineers, and we were seeing some attrition happen naturally after 1 to 3 years, where it was good reasons to leave, But for us to build a company to have that type of turnover, it was going to be very challenging, very expensive, and most likely not that successful. So what we've seen happen is that the people in that millennial generation that have stayed now more than 3 years have skilled up in the job. And we've seen them invest in their own training, and we've also invested in that. So some of our success stories are people that have started in customer success and are now in solution architecture. Some that have started in entry-level HTML and are now in JavaScript. So we're working on this hypothesis that the millennials in the workforce are going to be the first generation that can skill up multiple times throughout their career rather than just stay on one track. So we're trying to build a platform that allows that internal mobility to happen a lot more smoothly rather than expecting just fill those positions and they're going to be out in 3 years and you have to deal with it. So from your perspective, at a lot bigger scale than what we see, are you seeing that happen at J&J as well?
Yeah, so maybe a couple of points on that topic. So I'm very privileged, I feel, to be a leader at J&J who is a millennial myself. And so I feel that I play a role in the organization to really be a voice of that generation within J&J. And I lead our Millennial Employee Resource Group, which is about 13,000 employees. I mean, I think that it's really a multi-generational thing. I think my dad, he recently retired. He was with the same company for 40 years, and he probably had to only reinvent himself every decade. I think the generation in the workforce today, the millennial generation, the new generation going to the workforce, I think they're facing a very different economy that is just built on very different building blocks. And the speed of innovation is so fast that we have to reinvent ourselves every 3 to 4 years in order to stay relevant in the workplace. And the way that we see that at J&J, I actually think is fascinating because millennials don't care as much about titles or levels. They deeply care, however, about new experiences and different experiences. And so where our HR function is really built up of structure and pyramids and how you move upwards, I think millennials are much more interested in how do I get many more experiences in the workplace. And that makes us have to rethink a lot of the employee experience. And so, for example, what's really important is if you have certain skills today, what are the adjacent skills to your current skills? Because that can predict what kind of jobs you might want to go into and what kind of different experiences that you want to create. And so I think it drives HR functions to think about work very differently. Because millennials and younger generations, I think about experience building very differently.
That's great to hear. Well, I just want to thank everyone for participating. We might have time for 1 or 2 questions, if there are any in the audience. Sure, hold on one sec.
Hi, thanks very much. I was just wondering, how did you measure your company values?
The question was, how do you measure the company values, to Sjoerd?
Well, it starts by defining what they are, and so we did that about 75 years ago, and then we measure them every year through an annual, what we call Credo survey. And so every employee would rate how well the company is doing against our core values, and that's how we measure it. Oh, sure. So his follow-up question was, how are you assessing talent in your hiring process against your core values? And so we worked with our IO psychology team inside of J&J to build a proprietary assessment, and they have translated our core values into a set of questions that are part of our application process that puts a value on how closely someone's own personal values are aligned to J&J's corporate values.
Any other questions? Oh, one more in the back.
So when you do a questionnaire like that, is there a concern that you will end up with people, that you will limit your pool in a way that might not be as diverse or welcoming to people who aren't already in the company?
That's a great question. So when we design an assessment like that, obviously that's something that we very closely watch. It's gone through multiple levels of validation to avoid exactly the point you're making. And right now the results that we're seeing is that it actually cuts out people who would have been cut out much later in the process Now they get cut off much earlier in the process, and as a result, our recruiters can actually spend more time with quality candidates versus anything else. The cutoff rates aren't like 40 or 50% or anything that crazy, but I think it sends a very powerful message that the core values of a company aren't just something that hangs on a poster on an office wall, but are actually a critical component of what we assess for as part of our hiring process.
All right, we'll end it there. Well, thank you so much for your time and coming to our talk.